Hey, I'm Briz and this is netnet, and in this video we're going to build on the core concepts of HTML that I introduced in the last video by using one of netnet's guided templates to create our first proper HTML page. I've mentioned before that this platform, netnet.studio, is both a place for creating the web but also learning about it, and a lot of that learning happens in our learning guide, which you can open up by clicking on netnet's face. In this learning guide there are a lot of different learning modes. I mentioned also in the last video that if you go to our docs, netnet.studio/docs, and go to the bottom of the Dear Students section, there's this little intro to the learning guide. Again, that's this widget right here. And in this intro, which you can dive deeper into, I mentioned these 4 learning modes. We've got these interactive tutorials, like the orientation tutorial that I posted a couple videos back. We've got these guided intros, like the guided intro to HTML that we covered in the last video. We've got annotated demos. I'll show a couple examples of those in the next video. But in this video, we're going to go over guided templates. We can find these guided templates throughout the studio. One place is in the learning guide. Underneath each language, there's usually a few links to some templates. This is the one that we're going to do, the HTML5 basic template. So I can launch into that by clicking it there. But I want to remind you that if you ever come across anything here in the studio and you forget where you found it, you could always click on netnet's face and search for it in the search bar. And so I can launch this template right off the search bar as well. Now, on netnet, a template is more than just a template. So in the world of web development more broadly, a template is some code that somebody else wrote for others to use as a starting point for their own projects. That could be some code contained in a single file, or it can be a folder with a collection of files, and whether those are code files or assets that then you use as a starting point to build your own projects from. But because netnet is also a place to learn about all this stuff, anytime you come across templates on netnet, you also have the option to have netnet guide you through that template, which is to say, build it out line by line and explain what all the pieces are as it goes. So that's the first thing you see when you launch a template. We could start a brand new project from that template, but we can also ask netnet to guide us through it, and that's what we're going to do. When you launch a guided template, you'll notice a couple things. First, that we have this project template guide widget down here. This is going to show us like how far along we are in the progress of this guide, but also it's a navigation tool we can use to jump around to later or earlier parts of the template. You'll also notice that at the top of the editor, the name of the guided template we're on is always listed, as well as this guide button. That guide button is good for relaunching this widget if we were to close it accidentally or intentionally, and we want to reopen it later. We can always click on the guide button, and that resumes our guide. So we're going to have netnet kind of jump into that with us. Before we dive too deep into it, though, one thing I want to point out is that what we're going to build is a conventional starting point for most HTML pages. It's not technically required, but it's oftentimes taught as like the default structure that every page needs. Now again, this is a convention. We don't technically need this for our code to work. I'll come back to this at the end of the video just to prove this point. But it is there for a reason. As artists, we love challenging and breaking conventions, but before we do that, it's important to understand why the convention exists. What are they and what are they for? So that when we break conventions, we can do that a bit more intentionally from an informed place. For example, while it's not technically necessary, it's always a good idea, as netnet says, to start an HTML5 with a doctype, like this one. An HTML5, actually, let's go back. Let's go back to the doctype. We can ask netnet a little more about this doctype, and it'll explain that this isn't an HTML element in the conventional sense. It's actually a declaration to the browser letting it know the era in which this page was written. So HTML has gone through a lot of changes. We've had new elements introduced that weren't there in the beginning. The way that we write the elements has changed. In the era of HTML 1.0, used to write all the elements in all caps. Now, as you've noticed, we write them in lowercase. And so this doctype lets browsers know the era the page was written in so that it can properly render it when you're using elements or syntax that is no longer part of HTML. So this is the HTML5 doc type, but there are older doc types for pages that were written in previous eras of HTML. And presumably, as HTML on the web continues to evolve, there might be other eras of HTML, HTML6 or 7 or who knows what, and that might come with its own syntactical changes or new elements. And in order to make sure that the page we write today is as future-proof as possible, it's a good idea, it's a convention to include this doc type so that browsers of the future will know how to properly render the code that we write today in the era of HTML5. So moving on, the first element we usually always create when kind of approaching things conventionally is the HTML element. As netnet mentions, this is the outermost or the top level element, which is also why we call it a root element. All the other elements are going to be somewhere nested within this opening and closing HTML tag. We're also going to go ahead and add an attribute. Again, this is a term and a concept we introduced in the last video. So if you're not familiar with what elements are and what attributes are, you should definitely visit netnet.studio and relaunch the guided intro to HTML, or just watch the last video that I posted on this channel. But here we've got an attribute, and as netnet explains, the line attribute tells the browser and assistive technologies like screen readers what language the text on your page is written in. This helps improve accessibility by allowing screen readers to use the correct pronunciation rules, and it also helps search engines understand and index your content more accurately. So again, while not technically necessary, this is going to make our page a bit more accessible and going to improve our SEO, the search engine optimization. What if we have many different languages on the same page? Maybe there's a section written in English, section written in Spanish. What do we do then? I'm going to let you visit netnet.studio and go through this guided template yourself if you want to take any of the tangents in this guided lesson. But for the recording, I'm going to stay on the main track here and move forward. So inside the HTML element, within the HTML opening and closing tag, you should always have two elements, the head and the body. Another way of saying this is more technical lingo, is that the head and the body are children of the HTML element. So the HTML element is the parent of the head element and the body element. This is how we describe the relationship between these elements. In the last video, we only ever saw an element contain text content. Between the opening and closing tags, we would place text, and we're going to do that soon in this video too. But we could also structure a page by putting elements within other elements. So in this case, the head and the body are both within the HTML element. And so we describe the relationship usually by saying like parent and child, or descendants. We use this kind of terminology in code. It will literally show up in code that you write in the future. So it's important to be familiar with that. So within the head element, within the opening and closing head tag, this is where our metadata goes. This is information about our page, rather than the page's content, the stuff that we see. That's going to come later in the body. And so netnet mentions that it has left a little comment for us here to remind us of that. So let's talk about comments. Netnet will explain comments if you go back and do this guided template on your own, but I'll demo a bit about comments myself. So I'm going to click here to edit the code. And since I'm in a guided template, netnet is stopping to warn me. Netnet is saying, I'm glad that you want to experiment, but before you try to edit some of the code in my editor, don't forget that during a walkthrough, your edits will be lost when you ask me to continue the guide. So if you want to just work on your own HTML from scratch and mess around with it, you could always visit netnet.studio/sketch. You'll immediately get a blank canvas and you can start coding whatever you want on there. But since we're currently in a guided walkthrough, a guided walkthrough of this template, we can't start building our own projects until we get to the end of this guide and we have the full template to start building on. But we can experiment with this template as we go. But when we pick back up and we continue the guide, netnet's going to get rid of any edits we made. So you don't want to spend too much time building out anything too complex, but it is helpful to kind of just mess around and experiment while we go through the guide just to understand this a little bit better. So I'm going to let netnet know I understand these terms. I'm going to mess around here with some comments. I'm going to write another comment here and be like, this is also a comment for myself. Now, it's not actually a comment. It doesn't have the syntax of a comment, so it's getting accidentally rendered on my page here. And this is definitely an accident because within the opening and closing head tag, we don't want any content. Nothing that goes in that head tag should be rendered as content on our page. But it happened by accident because I forgot the comment syntax. So in order to make this a comment, you have to write less than, $, dash, dash, space, and then on the other end, another dash, dash, greater than. Now that's become a comment. That's very esoteric kind of syntax. In fact, while all coding languages have a means of leaving comments, usually the syntax is much simpler, like 2 slashes or a pound symbol or something like that. HTML involves the most typing, but we don't have to type to create a comment because there's a shortcut key for that. I'm going to open up netnet's shortcut widget so we can see this. There are loads of shortcut keys that are built in, not just to netnet, but most code editors. And I've got some of them listed here, including this command / or control if you were on Windows or Linux /. And this is what's used to turn any line into a comment or any comment into a normal line of code. So let me show you what that looks like in practice. If I place my cursor here on this line and I do command /, it uncomments that line. It turns it back into content. Same with this other comment, /. Now it also gets uncommented, but pressing that same shortcut key again turns that line back into a comment. And if I highlight a group of text, I can turn both lines together into one comment. This is helpful not just so that I can quickly leave little notes to myself. That's one of the reasons developers use comments, to leave notes, reminders to themselves or to other coders who might be looking at their code. But it's also a nice way to turn certain lines of code on and off when you think you might want to use it, but you don't want to use it now, but you don't want to delete it. For example, let me write an HR element here. You might remember from the last video that the HR element creates a solid line across the page. If I create more of them, I'll get more of these lines. Now let's say I like how this looks. I might want to use it later, but I don't want to use it just yet because there's some other content I want to add to my page or something. I can highlight this entire section of code and use the shortcut key command or control /. And now those lines have disappeared, but they disappeared without having to delete them. They're just commented out. They're kind of turned off temporarily until I decide later to bring them back. So these are different ways we use comments, and this is a super helpful shortcut key for doing that. All right, so now I'm going to click the guide and ask netnet to return to the guide, which will remove all these edits I've made. Okay, so in the head where our metadata goes, one example of metadata netnet mentions is our page's title. This doesn't show up on the page itself, but it appears in the browser tab, in the history, in search results, and in link previews when others share your page on social media platforms. If you've ever shared a link on social media and those little cards come up in this little title for that web page, that text is coming from our title element. So I'm going to go ahead and put a title, call it Nick's homepage. Great. Now netnet is adding a couple of meta tags. We also introduced these in the last video. These are also examples of singleton tags like the HR. It doesn't have a closing tag. It consists only of the opening tag. That's the full element. But the meta tag also needs some attributes in order to create the metadata that we want to create. For example, when a meta tag has a name attribute of author, then we can use it to credit the author of this page. So I'll put my name in here. And you'll see that netnet has now added my name as the value to the content attribute. So this meta tag has two attributes, a name attribute, which sets its purpose to author, and a content attribute, which sets the value of the particular author of this page to my name. Now it's going to do something similar with the next meta tag. This meta tag, the purpose of the metadata here is going to be a description of my page. So again, when our website shows up in Google search results, whatever we put here is what's going to be in the little search box, little card. Same with when we share our URL on social media sites, the little info underneath the title is going to be whatever we type in here. Or I'll just tell netnet go ahead and type its own description so I don't have to type it myself. One last meta tag before we move on from this section. This one is for mobile devices. This is going to make our website more mobile friendly. By default, without this meta tag here, if you were to visit this page on a mobile device, it's going to look like it's shrunk, like it's going to look really tiny. This meta tag fixes that. It makes it look a bit more like we might expect. Exactly how this works and why, you can click on this link. Again, I'll remind you, if you visit netnet.studio yourself and you go through this interactive guide on your own, you can click on that link. That'll take you to a website called Stack Overflow, super popular website where coders of all languages help each other solve problems and have discussions about code. In this case, a discussion about this particular meta tag. Moving on. We're going to jump into our body elements. And it says, now that our metadata is set up, let's move on to the actual content. I've left a comment inside the body to remind you that this is where all the elements go that will actually get rendered or be displayed on our page. First thing netnet's going to do is create an h1 element. You might recall from the last video, this is how we create headers or titles on our page. So I'll say Nick's corner of the World Wide Web. Now netnet's asking me about a paragraph, what I want to put some content underneath my header. But before we go any further, I do want to point out that we can't actually see my header because netnet's speech bubble, the passage, the convo dialog here, is covering it. And so this is a good time to introduce the coding menu. If I click on netnet's face and I click on this icon, I get a menu that has to do with my code and the editor. This is particularly useful when we're creating our own projects, not necessarily when we're going through a guide, but a particular feature might be helpful in this case. First, just by opening the coding menu, netnet is no longer talking, right? And so I can see my title, right? I can see this h1 element actually getting rendered on the page. But I point this out because in the editor settings, we can change the layout. By default, usually netnet has this, what we call dock left, it's docked on the left side layout, but I can also say dock it on the bottom. And now if netnet keeps talking, the speech bubbles will be over here, and I'll be able to see what's going on in my page. I can also change the layouts using a shortcut key. So if I open up that shortcuts widget again, and apart from these common coding shortcuts that you find in code editors, there's also some shortcuts that are netnet specific, including this shortcut for changing the layout. Command or control greater than and less than will cycle through the different layouts one by one. Let me show you what that looks like. I'm going to use the shortcut key now, and here I am cycling through the different layouts. Lots of different layouts. Some have some features that others don't. I'll let you explore those on your own. But for now, I just want to point that out. In case I change the layout to kind of see what's going on, you'll know how it is that I did that. So how do we resume? We click the guide button again. Let netnet know we want to continue down this guide. Okay, so we had left off after having created the header. Netnet said, what do I want to put in the paragraph here? I'll say this page is still under construction. Okay, now netnet's gotten rid of all of our spaces and carriage returns, line breaks rather. It says, you may have noticed that every time I create a new child element, an element that's inside of another element, I've added some spaces before the parent element's content. This is called indentation. In HTML, indentation isn't technically required by the browser for the code to work. If we were to remove all the indentation and the line breaks, as it just did, you'll notice that the rendered page looks exactly the same, but the code is much harder to read. Let me switch here to another layout. You can see here, the output is exactly the same, but the code is much harder to read. Keeping good indentation makes the structure of our HTML much cleaner. And it says that a good rule of thumb is an element's opening and closing tags when they're on, actually I'll just explain this. If the element's opening and closing tag is in the same line, right, like it is in this title, then obviously there's nothing we have to do about it. But if they're on separate lines, say like this p tag, the opening p tag and the closing p tag should line up. And then any content within it should be indented once over. So starting from the top, from the root element, HTML, that one has no indentation because it's our root element. The head which when I click on, by the way, and this is common in most code editors, if I click on the opening head tag, you should see the closing head tag underlined. So this is a quick way to make sure, like, wait, are the two of them indented as I would expect? Head is indented once because it's inside of HTML, and the closing tag is also indented once, so that looks clean. But then the title, as with all of our metas, these are inside the head, which are inside the HTML. So these are indented twice. Let's say our indentation does get messy. We don't quite have things indented as we expect. And this definitely can happen. I see this happen all the time with my students as we start building out our code and adding more and more code and moving things around. It can get a little messy with our indentation. We can actually ask netnet to tidy our code, to clean it up, to sort of re-indent things in this conventional fashion. There's a couple ways to do that. In the coding menu again, if you go to My Code this time instead of Editor Settings, and you choose Tidy Code, netnet cleans up that indentation for you. And as with all things in the studio, if you forget where that is, you could always click on netnet's face and use the search bar and search for tidy code and tidy your code that way. One thing to point out, returning to this concept of conventions, is that this is the conventional way to indent your code. You might come up with your own sort of way to organize your code. Some artists, I've seen some folks actually organize their code so that it almost looks like its own image, kind of like you're making ASCII art, and so that their art is just as much the rendered output as it is the way they've organized their code. So you can get really creative with this because, again, the browser doesn't care how you indent your code. It's going to render the same thing no matter what. The indentation is really something we get to decide. And usually the convention is to indent it this way for the purpose of making it easier to read. So we can at a glance kind of see which elements are children of which other elements, which are children of which other elements. Okay, so returning to the guide. We're getting close to the end here of the guide. One of the last things that netnet is going to do is actually create a nav element. And within that nav element, it's putting two A tags, two anchor tags, which, as we discussed in the last video, is how we create links. Now, it mentions here that if you have a group of A tags that you're using for navigation, either kind of like to jump around to different pages on your own web page or to jump to other web pages like we're doing here, it's oftentimes a good idea to wrap them within these nav elements rather than just having the links on their own. It's not technically necessary, but it is a convention. It explains why, that while it's not required, it's good semantic practice. Semantic is a word we use in web development to talk about, and you can click here to dive deeper into this notion, but to write things in a way that are very clear to the machines which are used by the people. So for example, for accessibility, for search engines optimization, like we mentioned before, when you follow these semantic practices, when you use the elements in the ways that they were designed to be used, it's going to perform a lot better in certain devices like accessibility tools. It's going to rank higher in your search results and all sorts of things. So this is why we have these conventions for a purpose. And when you follow these conventions, this is what you get. But we can break from these conventions, and there are times when we might want to. And I'll come back to that as I alluded to earlier. But the last thing netnet kind of touches on is the A tag, kind of reviewing what we discussed last time, that you use this href attribute in order to point to a website you want the link to go to once it gets clicked. All right, so if I were to click this link, let me scroll down here. The link that says working on this, that's this link here. It's inside of an A element that has an href attribute that's pointing to this Wikipedia page. We see the URL to a Wikipedia page. And so if I click on that link, we now jump to that Wikipedia page. Whoop. And then it mentions that this attribute, href, stands for hypertext, or the H in href stands for hypertext. The breakthrough idea that made the web different from the older linear forms of media, linear like a book that you read from, first page to last page, or like a film that you watch from beginning to end. The web is nonlinear. The web is a broader metamedia commons, is a broader platform. You interact with more kind of like the way that we think. This is a concept that that goes way back before the web. There's a writer named Vannevar Bush who wrote an article called As We May Think and introduced a hypothetical machine called the Memex, which so many of these technologies sort of evolved from or were inspired by, where when we're thinking about things, our brain oftentimes leaves these trails of associations. We have one thought and then a jump to another thought, and then we jump to another thought, and we end up somewhere very different from where we started. And that's kind of how it feels like to navigate the web when you're using links. You're on one page, you click on one link, you jump to another page, you click on another link, you jump to another page, and you go surfing across the web, and who knows where you might end up. This is a concept that, oh no, we're not there yet. That I discussed in depth in the last video, and I kind of want to come back to because it's such an important part of the web. And also, again, what makes it kind of tricky to really wrap our heads around understanding what's at its core. It's a quote from Tim Berners-Lee from his book, Weaving the Web, where he talks about the origins of the World Wide Web, where he says, what was often difficult for people to understand about the design was that there was nothing else beyond URIs or URLs, HTTP, and HTML. There was no central computer controlling the web, no single network in which these protocols worked, not even an organization anywhere that ran the web. The web was not a physical thing that existed in a certain place. It was a space in which information could exist. So again, this is what defines the web: URLs, HTTP, and HTML. We've discussed HTML. This is the language that we've been writing. HTTP and URLs, that's how we can send requests to these HTML pages. That's how a browser can ask a server running on another computer to send them a copy of that HTML. The URLs that we write always begin with this HTTP or HTTPS, Hypertext Transfer Protocol. The P there, protocol, is a term in computer science which refers to a set of rules. And so long as all the computers that coexist in a particular technology follow those rules, things should work as one would expect. So in this case, HTTP is the set of rules for how servers and browsers should send HTML pages to each other. And if you want to make your own browser, as I mentioned in the last video, you can, or your own server, as long as it functions in a way that follows these rules of how HTTP works, then it should be able to request and or receive pages from any other server. And so the web itself, this giant collection of web pages that anybody can make, isn't a physical thing. Your web page might exist in a particular computer, whether that's a data center where you've uploaded to host your page, or even on your own laptop if you decide to host your website on your own computer. That's a specific place where your web page exists. But the web more broadly has no one specific computer or data center that runs it. Unlike other centralized technologies, the web is decentralized, and it exists as long as people are running servers and publishing their websites. It is, as Tim Berners-Lee mentioned, a space in which information could exist. And that kind of concludes the guided template. From here, we have a few options. We can jump to another guided template that's going to build on this one. A lot of the guided templates on NetNet can actually build on each other and expand. So it's another lesson about more metadata that we can go into, and feel free to explore that on netnet.studio if you're curious. But we can also say, I'll take it from here. And there's a few different ways to take it from here. If I was logged in, and by which I mean if NetNet was connected to GitHub, that's something that I'll talk about in a future video, a couple videos from now, I could actually create a brand new project with this template here as a starting point. But I could also just start messing around with it. I can just start sketching. So I can say I just want to sketch first. And now you'll notice that the guide disappeared. I don't have that guide button at the top of the editor anymore. I don't have that widget open with the timeline. So what I'm working on now is just a sketch. I've started with this template, and now I can build on it. I can change the title, adding some more exclamation marks. And maybe I'll get rid of this link, so on and so forth. Before I close out this video, I want to go back to some of the points I mentioned at the beginning about following conventions and whether this is technically necessary or not. Hopefully now, as I pointed out, the purpose of these different pieces, you understand if and when and why you might need these, or if you might want to break from these conventions. So if you were, for example, writing a manifesto. Artists love writing manifestos. And if you wrote a manifesto and you published it to the web, you probably do want to follow these conventions, right? Because you want to make sure that your manifesto is accessible to a wide audience, that it is indexable and can be found on a search engine, and following all these conventions help towards that goal. But maybe you're exploring the web as an experimental medium. You're trying to see what happens when you mess around with different elements, or maybe you have some other goals. There are artists that we'll discuss in future videos, like the artists in the demo scene, which don't really share their work always published on the web. They share them at festivals, at gatherings called demo parties, where they compete to see who could make the craziest thing out of code. And oftentimes, one of the things they compete on is who could do the wildest things with the least amount of code possible. And if that's the case, you might not want all this extra code. You might want to go straight to the particular code that is going to be part of your demo. Similarly, there's another scene that we'll discuss in future videos when we get to CSS called the CSS art scene. And there, the whole thing is, how can you push that language CSS to its limits, and how can you create incredible visual compositions using only CSS code? And so you want to keep your HTML as minimal as possible, because the point is just to use CSS. And in that case, they also are not going to use this full structure, because that's not the point of their particular work. So there are times when you might want to break conventions. I'll show one example from the net art scene at the end of this video in a second. But first I want to point out, I don't know if you noticed, I did this real quickly, but instead of typing out all of the pieces of syntax for this H1 element, I just typed in H, and that created this drop-down list, this what's called a hinting list. This is a sort of code completion, an autocomplete list, where I can choose different options, and then it'll create the full element for me. And in some cases, that's a lot of code. Say I have a tag, or an A tag I want to open up in a new tab. It'll create this full line for me. Hey there. And so now this link is going to go to whatever I put into the href as we discussed, but because I have target, which is a separate attribute, set to blank, when I click on this link, instead of replacing the page I'm currently on, it's going to open it up on a new tab. And I was able to get this snippet of code very quickly just by hitting A, choosing this autocomplete, and boom, have the snippet. This is a common feature you find in most code editors. They have this kind of hinting feature, and they usually don't just autocomplete single elements. You can also get little snippets, and we've got loads of creative coding snippets actually specifically for creative coding built into netnet. But we also have this HTML template. This is very similar to the template that we just went through, but it's a kind of more reduced, more minimalist version of that template, which we can use if we do want that structure, but we want to get going quickly. It's also there in the snippets menu. Usually when I'm teaching this in class, one of the things that students ask around this point is, what are the other HTML elements? Like, once they realize that there's a list, they want to see that list. Where are the rest of them? Same with the attributes. What are all of the HTML attributes? And to answer that question, I kind of want to make a reference here, give a shout out to a couple of creative technologists I referenced in the orientation video, Alan Kay, Adele Goldberg, and the other creative folks at Xerox PARC, this computer research lab from the 1970s. They didn't just create terms like metamedia that I introduced and that I'll be covering again in the next video. They also created technology that didn't exist before, that had become standard today, like Ethernet, like laser printers, and even the graphical interface. Everything that we see here and take for granted, like the mouse, which didn't exist before we had graphics because we didn't need it, because everything was just linear text or code on a screen. All of that started at Xerox PARC. And not only has that aesthetically influenced what we've got going on here in netnet.studio, in many ways it's conceptually influenced us as well. So, quick side note here.
Our research group at the Palo Alto Research Center is involved in the development of software and hardware for personal computing. The information in the computer and the ways of dealing with that information are accessible to you, even if you don't know a lot about what computers are about. We don't think about computers as simply things for manipulating numbers or places in which you can present words, but we combine the numbers and the words with good visual presentation, nice pictures, graphics, and also sound. In terms of techniques for accessing information, a key presentation technique we've used is to divide up the display screen into rectangular areas or parts that people like to call windows. And so they're windows onto information. The primary kind of window that we like to talk about is one that we call a browser. We do this because too often we think of computers as being very precise machines in which you have to precisely say, I want this or that, and you get it back exactly what you asked for. But the nice quality of a library is that you can walk around looking for something specific, but as you're doing it, you find other things. And that's what browsing is all about.
And to that point, if we were going to do something a little less conventional in the browser, we might not know what that thing is. You know, oftentimes writing code feels like what it felt like to use computers before graphical interfaces ever existed, where you, as Adele Goldberg mentioned, need to know exactly what you want to do, type it out, and then get the computer to do that thing. But as artists, that's not always our relationship to code. Sometimes we want to explore, experiment, and get ideas from the process of messing around with code itself. And one way to do that, one way to sort of get ideas, is to explore what other code is out there. In this case, what are all the other HTML elements? What are all the other HTML attributes? And so we've got that built right into netnet. And there's a few ways that we can get that list. In the learning guide, if we go to the HTML section, and actually all the languages have these docs like these, you see links to docs. So here, HTML, or the element list, this is going to open up a list of all the HTML elements, and we also have this attributes list, which will open up a list of all the HTML attributes. But my preferred way of finding those docs, and actually quicker and I think more interesting way to get there, is that when you're writing code in netnet, and this isn't common in other code editors, it's specific to this environment here, you can double-click any piece of code, and netnet will explain that code to you, at least briefly. And you could ask netnet to tell you more about that code, which opens up those docs, specifically the entry for the code that you double-clicked, in this case, the H1. But when we click back here, we get back to that full list of elements. Same with the attributes, right? If I double-click this lang attribute, netnet explains to me what that does. I can say, tell me more, and I can click the back button, and now I've got that full list of HTML attributes. Definitely recommend you just explore, see what other elements there are. In the next video, we're going to go over some of the media elements like video, audio, images. But there might be other elements that are rarely used that might inspire an idea for you. One example, piece I want to kind of end this video on, is a piece by a net artist named Evan Roth called All HTML. Unfortunately, the website is no longer up, at least not when I just checked. It was all-html.net, but our snippets menu, I mentioned before, we've got these autocompletes. Our snippets menu also has some Easter eggs. I don't know if other code editors put Easter eggs in their hinting menus, but we do. If you type in Evan, you get this piece by Evan Roth, the all HTML piece from 2011. It creates this abstract composition. But what is this abstract composition? Well, when exploring HTML elements, Evan had an idea, and he thought, what if I put all the elements inside of all the elements? What would it look like? So again, this is not the conventional HTML structure. This is an example of a work that's breaking from those conventions, but with a very intended purpose. At the center of the page, there's one sentence, which says one sentence contained within every HTML tag in alphabetical order. And you notice that these are inside of an opening and closing var tag, which itself is inside of an opening and closing UL tag, which itself is inside of a closing and opening U tag, all the way up to the A tag. And what happens when you put every HTML inside of every other HTML? You get this strange composition. This is also an example of what we might call form art. This is a subgenre in the NetArt scene, and also something that we're going to discuss in the NetArt tutorials, which I'll post as a video at some point on this channel. But I'll remind you that everything I'm posting on this channel is all already on netnet. We can click on the learning guide, and if you go to the HTML section, at the bottom here, we have some interactive tutorials, including this interactive tutorial on the NetArt scene, which dives a little deeper into all of that. So I'll end it there for now, and in the next video, we'll look at some more elements and some examples of NetNet's annotated demos.